Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to this press conference with Dr. Liam Fox of the United Kingdom. Before I give Dr. Fox the floor, a few housekeeping points. This press conference involves journalists who are participating in person and also via WebEx. If you are participating via WebEx and would like to ask a question, please raise your hand by pressing the icon at the bottom of the screen. I would be also very grateful if all journalists would please identify themselves and their news organizations before taking the floor. Interpretation in the room will be provided in English, French, and Spanish. A complete bio for Dr. Fox is available now on the WTO website, and the statement he has just delivered to the General Counsel will be on the site very soon. Dr. Fox will give a brief opening statement, and then we will take your questions. We have precisely 30 minutes for this press conference. Dr. Fox, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Keith. Good afternoon, everyone.
There you go.
Lesson number one, never have a microphone that's coded red and green for someone who's red-green colorblind. Yeah. So, as I was saying, as we meet here in Geneva to select, at the beginning of the process of selecting a new Director-General, there are a number of key points I think that we need to emphasize. Number one, this is not going to be business as usual. The way in which the world is changing and will be changed by the COVID pandemic will have implications in the global economy, which in turn will have consequences for global trade, and I'm very happy to take some questions on that. Second is, this is a great organization. At its best, it has taken part in that great global project that has taken 1 billion people, 1 billion of our fellow human beings out of abject poverty in just one generation. One of the greatest achievements, I believe, in human history. But talking to people here this week and over the last few months and years, there is a feeling here that everything isn't as it should be, that we have lost some of the political momentum that's required. Why do I say we need political momentum? Because in an organization that is based on consensus, you have to make compromise. And compromise is easier when you have the vision to understand that making short-term sacrifices sometimes are necessary for the longer-term benefits. I think we also here have to set ourselves the ambition for the forthcoming ministerial conference, MC12. And I would suggest we have two themes. We have to reset what we are doing, not just focusing on our legacy projects, but focusing on some of the challenges that are ahead. I mentioned in the previous session some of the difficulties that may come from our agricultural discussions, which have long been a difficulty as a legacy issue, but may get more difficult as a consequence of the implications of the COVID pandemic. And we need to recommit to the principles of an international rules-based trading system. Not just because of the reasons, the positive reasons that I gave about why we have achieved so much because of that, but because of the negative implications of the alternative. Because the alternative to our rules-based system is a system where the strongest get what they want and everyone else follows in their wake. I'm a great believer in free trade, but free trade must not be a free-for-all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the floor first. Peter, is your hand up? You have the floor, please.
Dr. Fox, one of the crises of the...
Can you identify yourself, Peter,
Sorry,
please?
yeah. My name is Peter Kenny. I work for the Anadolu Agency. The crisis of the WTO this year seems to have been due to the kind of breakdown in the multilateral trading system, and due in great part to the conflict between two of the big nations of the world. Can you say why the multilateral trading system is so important for the world, and how you will, or what you will do to try to fix it and get these two conflicting parties to resolve it through this organization?
Great. Well, that'll take up the half hour. So first of all, as Trade Secretary, in 2018, I paid 5 visits to Beijing and 5 visits to Washington. As you can imagine, that was at the height of the tension between the US and China. I maintained the view, which I maintain to this day, that we are not there to become involved in taking sides in bilateral trade disputes inside the trading system. Our role is the maintenance of the rules-based system. Why do I say this? Which goes to the core of the answer to your question. If we don't apply the rules that we have already agreed to, if we try to make it a kind of a la carte, as I described in the Q&A earlier, then what is the credibility of rules that we sign up to in the future? If we cannot carry through on the obligations we already have through our agreed legal and treaty architecture, what is the value of any future legal or architectural treaty change? And so there's questions of the practicality, that we have all benefited from our rules-based system. As I mentioned, the alternative to that, all through my dealings, we did a lot of very constructive trade work, market access and others with both the United States and China. But all through that, my view was then, and my view would be as DG, that we are there to take the side of the rules-based system because it has worked and because the alternative is actually not something that I would like to think too much about. And there has been a debate around that, and the assumption has been that the rules-based system is needed more for very small countries because they would be more vulnerable in a free-for-all, which to an extent is true. But I've been making the case this week that a country the size of the UK, the world's 5th biggest economy, would also be damaged by a breakdown in the system because we export 30% of our GDP. Germany, the world's 4th biggest economy, exports 49% of its GDP. If we don't have that rules-based system to give stability and predictability to our businesses, real businesses, which remember is what we're all about, real exporters, then I think the domestic and international consequences would be very detrimental.
Thank you very much. La prochaine question est pour Laurent Sierot de ATS. Laurent, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Laurent Sierot, Swiss News Agency. I haven't read any mention to Brexit in your opening speech to the General Council. Do you consider that the current context with the talks between your country and Brussels is rather an advantage or an obstacle in that process? And as the EU hasn't any candidates, do you expect the support of the EU countries? Thank you.
Well, very fortunately, not everyone in the world sees every issue through the Brexit prism. And if I were to be elected the Director-General, while I would always have an enormous affection and pride in my country, Britain would be one of 164 countries that would be looked after without fear or favour by the Director-General. In which case, the discussion between the United Kingdom and the European Union on Brexit would be a matter for those two parties. I hope that, as I have always hoped, that Britain will reach an open and liberal trade agreement with the European Union, not just as an issue in itself. And I think the importance of it has been accentuated by the COVID crisis. As the global economy is hit by the pandemic, and there are estimates that global GDP is set to plunge. It plunged by about 13% according to the OECD in the first half of 2020. Unemployment may reach its highest peak since the Great Depression. In that circumstance, I think there is an incentive not just to reach an agreement because it's good in itself for the two parties, but because it's a sign of confidence in that global economy that we can set the conditions fair for the recovery that we will require to make after the pandemic. As for who the European Union chooses, I hope the European Union will choose a candidate who's most in line with the values and the aspirations for global trade that the European Union has.
Thank you very much. Let's take one more question from the floor and then go to WebEx. So the question now is to Hao Qian of SINA. Qian, you have the floor, please.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Hello. My question is, first of all, we have noticed that you are a British politician. So do you have any British perspective if you have been elected as the new DG, given the fact that the country has a huge history of free trade? And secondly, about the Brexit, we could say some people would argue that Brexit actually breaks some credibility of the willingness of collaboration of the Great Britain in terms of your breakdown with the EU. So do you think, what's your interpretation regarding to this? Thank you.
Are there any particular British perspectives I bring? Actually, I mentioned during our question and answer that one of the things is about the role of the DG itself. And as you will know, as a student of these things, that in the United Kingdom, the role of the Prime Minister vis-à-vis the Cabinet is regarded as first among equals. I see the same concept applying to the DG. I think we should be looking to create a high quality and close-knit team of whom the DG may be the first, but he's also the equals. And I think that's very important in a consensus-based organisation. Secondly, yes, Britain does have a very strong commitment to free trade. And I worry, as I said in answer to the previous question, that concept of free trade is being questioned today, because I think it has done more to improve the lot of our fellow human beings, including in some of the world's most populous countries. And I think that we would be foolish to not recognize the value that that has brought. And I was also interested that throughout this week there have been very few questions about what does free trade bring to consumers, because a lot of this debate is viewed from a producer perspective rather than a consumer perspective. And when you think about it, you think back 10, 15 years, well, you may be too young to think back 10, 15 years, but you think about the cost of basic electrical items and how we've got better quality, better technology at lower prices. Why? Because we've got an open competitive system involving global supply chains, which will reduce costs and give better quality to consumers. It also is a system that provides greater choice in very common things. You go to a local supermarket and say, what would be the contents of the shelves be if we didn't trade with the Americas, with Africa, with Asia? And you'll see that there's not very much left. We consumers have become used to an open free trading system. I would like to see governments, and I'd like to see the WTO unleash the power of consumers more in making the case for the benefits of free trade.
Thank you very much. Let's take a couple.
I would have gone on longer, but I can see Keith looking up to say, that's enough, shut up.
We have quite a long list, Dr. Fox. Let's go to WebEx and take a question from Alan Beatty from the Financial Times. Alan, you have the floor, please.
Dr. Fox, hello. Another question about nationality, I'm afraid. A lot of people have said that wonderful country that the UK is, it has only just started to assert itself as an independent country at the WTO. And of course, it's, as we've heard, it's embroiled in fairly unpleasant negotiations with another very large member. And it's really quite premature for the UK to be putting forward a candidate for DG at this stage. What will you say to them?
I say that's wrong. I'd say, first of all, we're a founder member of the WTO. We have long experience working with our European partners and outside on a range of global issues. I would say that as well as our negotiations with the European Union, we're also embarked on new free trade agreements to seek greater liberalisation with the United States, with Australia and New Zealand, and potential accession to CPTPP. We also have a large number of rollover agreements that are all seeking to be at least as liberal as the ones that we've inherited from the European Union. I would have thought that was a country with a bold agenda and a great deal of self-confidence, both of which are required for the task.
Thank you very much. We'll take another WebEx question, this time from the other side of the Atlantic. Hannah Monacan from Inside U.S. Trade. Hannah, you have the floor, please.
Thanks, Keith. Good afternoon, Secretary Fox. Hannah Monacan, Inside U.S. Trade. Hello. The majority of previous directors general of both the GATT and the WTO have been Europeans. and many WTO members are pushing for more regional diversity in this top position. Are you confident that you can build support despite this push for regional diversity? And what do you think that you in particular would bring to this position?
Well, thank you. If I may be condescending and say that's a very good question, thank you. So, yes, I do understand the idea of diversity in the choice of any personnel. What I have discovered in the very widespread conversations that I've had with a range of members this week from all different parts of the globe and all different stages in that development spectrum is what I mentioned in my initial remarks. That this is a great organization, it's got great talent, it's got great technical expertise, it's got great commitment to the concepts, but it's not really where it should be. It's not held in the esteem that it should be amongst the multilateral organizations. People, I believe, when they think of the UN and the IMF and the World Bank, they should think of the WTO alongside. I think at one point they did. I'm not sure that that's as true today as it should be. And there is a longing to get some of that back. And there's an understanding that the problems here are not technical. Yes, there are technical problems that need to be dealt with, but the primary problem is not technical but political. It is, can we have the political weight to deal with it? And there's, from right across that spectrum, there's been a view expressed that whoever is the next DG will have to have some difficult conversations with some of the world leaders. And a lot of them have been asking, have you met President Xi? Yes. Have you met President Trump? Yes. Do you know Prime Minister Modi? Yes. And we need, I think, DG. And in answer to your question, Hannah, specifically, I think that the qualifications and the needs of the qualities of the DG change over time. I think this is an occasion when it does lend itself more to political rather than bureaucratic. And I think, therefore, it matters more what the DG brings to the organization in terms of skill and experience to be put at the disposal of all the members, each and every one of them, for their mutual benefit. In your other question, there was another issue that has been raised, as well as in part of that diversity agenda, which is gender. And I was making the point that as Trade Secretary, I appointed a female permanent secretary. In my time in DI, Department for International Trade, I was very proud of the number of women who were in that organization under my watch. And I did commit today, you may not have had time to see it, that if I do become Director General, I will ensure that half the senior leadership team of WTO are women. If you believe that empowerment of women is important, which is one of our great developmental goals, and if you believe it's important in education and politics, then it must also be true in trade. And if you believe that the empowerment of women is important, then empowerment in commerce has to begin here at the WTO, and we have to set an unequivocal example right at the very top.
Thank you very much. Let's take two questions from the floor. The first one for Nicholas Watt of BBC. Nicholas, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Nick Watt, BBC Newsnight. Dr. Fox, in your speech, you talked about how you've always supported a rules-based system, how you believe in international multilateral organisations, and how you abhor protectionism. Talk about how that sort of clogs up the arteries of the world trading system. Do you have anyone in mind, by any chance, anyone who might be standing for election in the fall?
I have no one in mind in that, because I believe, as I set out in that speech, way back at the end of World War II, we set out a set of principles that have stood the test of time. And those principles are as important today as they ever were. And everybody who is signed up to the WTO signed up to a set of rules and regulations. And part of the problems we've had is that across a number of members, they have taken to saying, well, of course we like the rules-based system, but we don't like this particular rule. I don't recall when countries signed up that they got the option to have waivers when it suited them. Now, clearly, inside that system, some exceptions and flexibilities have to be made, particularly for differential treatment of countries that simply don't have the capacity to be able to to deal with the complexities of the current global trading system. That's why, for example, in the Trade for Aid program as Secretary of State, I tripled that while I was in office. And I believe that if you stand back and you go back to the aims, which were, how do we create a system that can allow countries at different stages of development to access a rules-based system so that we can give the benefits of free trade to many, many different countries, their peoples and their businesses, then I think that you look at both enlargement, you look at how we deal with those differential elements, but above all, you commit yourselves to those basic principles. And I go back, Nick, to the answer I gave earlier. If you do not commit to the arrangements that you signed up to by treaty, those that have existed in the past, what is the credibility of those you might sign up to in the future? And I think that's an essential political element that every member has to genuinely ask themselves.
Thank you very much. Let's take a question from Bryce Bashuk from Bloomberg. Bryce, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Bryce Bashuk with Bloomberg News.
Hi, Bryce.
Dr. Fox, one of the major issues here at the WTO is a deficit of trust. Why do you believe that you have the integrity to lead this global organization? Thank you.
That echoes the question, Bryce, that my colleague from Costa Rica asked during the Q&A session. And my answer to that was, what do we mean by trust? In trust, we mean our ability to count on someone else to deliver on what they have said, promised, and so on. How do you get to trust? You get to trust by a combination of the experience of someone's behavior, and it's a function of time. I used the analogy that when I practiced medicine before I went into politics, or as my wife would say, when you had a real job, one of the ways in which you gained trust of a patient was being very straight with them. So transparency was a very big element in that building of trust. The communication and sharing of information was important. And also the willingness to sometimes have conversations that were uncomfortable but necessary. So all of those are elements. How does a DG help with that process? I think it is partly the ability to see both sides. Not always that you believe the two sides are equally right, but understanding why one side has the perspective that it does. And I think that is also a function of wider experience. It's certainly something that you live longer in politics if you possess than don't possess. And I think that, again, a political figure, I think, is more able to bring some of the qualities necessary at what is a very difficult time. I tried to get across in the comments I was making and in the Q&A that if we think this is already a difficult time, give us a year. Because I think things are going to get more difficult. And I made the point. I'm normally, as you know from experience, a very optimistic person. And I like to give people good news. And if people ask me, am I a glass half full man or a glass half empty man, I just say I'm Scottish, the glass isn't big enough. And I think that it's good to have that note of optimism, but you have to be realistic. And a lot of questions were about what would you do throughout this week? In the first 100 days, what would your agenda be? I'm acutely aware at the moment that this DG must not overpromise. We're not in business as usual. And it may well be that we would love to set X, Y, and Z as an agenda in normal times. But I'm very concerned that we will not be able to do that as a result of COVID. And therefore, I think that the question you raise about the building of trust is even more important now than it would normally be. And not overpromising, I think, is a very key, if difficult, self-denying ordinance for any politician.
Thank you very much. Let's take a question now from WhatsApp. This is from Celia Froof from Agência Estado of Brazil. And the question is, you are the only candidate from a developed country. Does this give you an advantage?
Well, you know, everybody's background, age, region, gender in this business gives you advantages and disadvantages. I suppose one of the issues that I feel very strongly about and raised in my initial comments was that if you compare where we are now facing the COVID crisis with where we were facing the financial crisis, we are in actually a more difficult position in terms of trade now than we were then, for the following reason. If you look at the last WTO OECD report for the last reporting period, there's some very interesting data in that. And it shows that back in 2009, only 0.7% of the imports of the G20 were covered by restrictive measures. That proportion has doubled pretty much every 2 years since 2009, so that at the end of 2019, 10.3% of all G20 imports were covered by restrictive measures. Now, what is the point, I asked, in us trying to improve the situation for global development, increasing aid for trade, increasing our contributions to a higher proportion of our GDP, if at the same time the world's biggest countries are raising their barriers to entry? We all have to abide by what we preach. One of the advantages perhaps I have in that is it may be easier for that message to be delivered by someone from a G20 country than from a developing country. It may be a marginal advantage, but I can just say, as I said in the Q&A, I'm not afraid to say that. As somebody who comes from a G20 country now, believe me, I would not be afraid to say it as DG.
Thank you very much. Let's take another WebEx question. This one from Andrew Walker from BBC. Andrew, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Keith. And hello, Dr.
Andrew,
Fox.
hi.
One of your biggest members of all, the United States, has got a lot of very, very fundamental problems, certainly under this administration, about the whole structure of the WTO and the way it does its business. How would you address those concerns?
Well, again, I'm not sure I entirely agree with the premise of the question. I think the US does have some very specific issues about some of the structures of WTO, particularly the appellate body. And my discussions with my US colleagues has basically taken the following format, which I repeated in the session we had today. First of all, remember why we have the appellate body. It's because we believed that the panel dispute resolution mechanism that came out of GATT, the panels went too wide, and they went beyond basic trade issues, and they went into territory that many felt was too political. So the appellate body was set up in a more quasi-judicial way with narrower remits to look at the legal issues relating to the trade rules and how they were applied in a dispute. Now, there are those who will say, as I said earlier, that the appellate body has gone beyond its remit, but because in negotiations they've not been completed and the appellate body has had to fill in the gaps. Others, notably the United States, believe that the appellate body has gone beyond its initial jurisdiction and there's been, if you like, mission creep, and that some of those areas that are not specifically about the legal basis of trade have been encroached upon. I made clear that's not something that I'm unsympathetic towards. But what I believe is that if we are able to get back to a much narrower definition of what the parameters are, then we should be willing to accept that in those very narrow circumstances, and how narrow you draw them would be a very important point of discussion, then we could have some concepts of precedent being set. My worry, which I share with my American colleagues, is at the moment they're drawn so widely that that concept of precedent is quite difficult for a lot of people to swallow. So I think the basic question, Andrew, is this, and it's not a technical one, it's a political one. Does everybody want the appellate body to be functioning properly as a dispute resolution mechanism? Because I believe that in a rules-based trading system, if you do not have a functioning dispute resolution, then the system itself is potentially under threat. And that is the question for all of us, and something of an existential one. If we don't believe that the AB system should be put back up and running, if we don't believe that we want it to be there, what is the alternative dispute resolution mechanism? Because a lack of that will actually put the whole rules-based system potentially under threat. Now, actually, I believe from my discussions with my American colleagues that they do wish to see that resolution mechanism in place, and I think there is room for compromise. And as I said, I think someone who can understand where both sides of the argument are coming from, then I think we can edge ourselves closer to the compromise that will be necessary to underpin the basic values of the system.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, and this is a WhatsApp question coming from Callum Jones of The Times. And Callum's question is, there is widespread support for reform of the WTO, but no consensus yet on what needs to change or how. What do you believe specifically needs to be reformed, and what happens if that is not achieved?
Callum, very good question. Several questions, actually, in one. Congratulations on being efficient. So I was asked a number of questions about the process of reform. My answer was that it falls into three categories. Conceptual reform, which goes back to the point I made earlier about recommitment to basic principles. That's what I think MC12 needs to focus on. Do we or do we not actually believe in the principles of most favoured nation, of national treatment, of transparency, the things that have held this organisation together and taken it forward for decades. So there is that conceptual challenge. Then there's an organisational challenge, which again I think comes at two levels. What does the team look like around the DG? I mentioned already, I think this concept of first among equals is not a bad concept to be operating in a consensual organisation. I also think there are two basic models that anyone in charge of an organisation takes in terms of their immediate team, their number twos, if you like. There are those who like a more compliant group of number twos because it allows them to get their way more often. There are those who take a different view that want the most talented and challenging group of number twos because they are able to say, you need to back off now or you need to step up here. I've always taken the view, Callum, as you know, that in the departments I've been in, that I wanted to have a strong team around me as possible, as I've often said, so that if I was run over by a bus, the department could move on seamlessly. The trouble with that in politics is that some of your colleagues want to become bus drivers. And I think that is the model I favour. Because we have an organisation where the head, the DG, has to travel quite a lot, and I think in the post-COVID period we'll have to do that. I think having the highest quality people next in command, if you like, you want to use that term in this organisation, it means that we can most seamlessly move on with our business. I also think in the Secretariat, which I think is very talented, it needs to balance its energies between legacy issues and the future challenges that we will face with equal energy, and I think there needs to be a better balance of responsibility in workload across the Secretariat. I think that overall, when you add the third element, the policy elements to that, we mentioned appellate body, for example. There are other elements on reform, on the outstanding issues such as fisheries. You've got a clear picture of where we ought to be going. It's not going to be an easy task. In fact, it's probably going to be a more difficult task than usual for the incoming DG, which is again why I end on this point, that this is not a job for a technocrat. This is a job for a politician, and probably one who's been around for a while and carries the scars of some difficult battles. Thank you.
Dr. Fox, we thank you very much for participating in this press conference. We thank all of you journalists who've participated both today and throughout the week here in person and via WebEx. I would ask, as Dr. Fox leaves, if there are any journalists who would like to speak to him, that they do so upstairs in the members' lounge directly above. Please do not block this corridor as Dr. Fox leaves because of Swiss social distancing regulations. We thank you all very much and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.